I will introduce our presenter and the author, or one of the authors of the report. Magnus Lofstrom is a PPIC research fellow. He's an economist with a PhD from UC San Diego, and he's done considerable work in the area of public safety recently at PPIC, as well as earlier labor markets and labor issues. So please welcome Magnus Lofstrom.
All right, thanks, Dave, and thank you all for coming here today and giving us this opportunity to share with you our latest research. This piece here is titled Public Safety Realignment and Crime Rates in California. This is joint work with Steve Raphael, who's at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. So I want to start off by giving you a figure here, kind of a visual of what's at the heart of this report here. And what I'm showing you are the prison and jail populations for the 9 months prior to realignment and the year after realignment. And what we see in these two, the top line being the prison population, the bottom line the jail population, we see that they're pretty flat prior to realignment, and the prison population, not surprisingly, start to decline rapidly with realignment. That is also coinciding with an increase in the jail population, but that increase is far less than the decrease in the prison population. So that is what we're trying to assess here. What is the role of this decreasing incarceration in California that came about with realignment? So before I get started on what we're doing here, let me give you a quick overview of what I'll be doing here for the next 25 minutes or so. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background information about realignment. I'll talk about some crime trends that we're observing and how we're going about trying to answer this question of what the role of realignment is in our crime trends. And then I'll share our results. Much of that analysis and what we're doing there will be focusing on California and county level data, but we're also going to take a step back and look at how California compared to other states to get a sense of what we find if it's also confirmed in the comparison of California to other states as well. And then we'll move on to talk about incarceration in this context of its effectiveness in terms of preventing crime. And I'll wrap it up with some conclusions and some recommendations as well. So realignment is clearly a major public safety reform. It's been called one of the most significant ones that we have seen in decades here in California. And it was prompted by a federal court order to reduce overcrowding in our prison system. And the way that the state addressed this problem, and at the time, the state had to reduce its prison population by about 35,000. So the way the state went about this was to shift responsibilities as well as funding from the state to the counties in how lower level felons are being managed. And so when I talk about lower level felons here, these are the offenders who are often the triple nons. These are offenders who are convicted of nonviolent, non-sexual, and non-serious offenses. And some of the key changes that took place with realignment that had an impact on the prison population was first that parole violators are no longer sent back to the state prison. They're now being sanctioned by the counties. Newly sentenced low-level felons are now going to county jail as opposed to state prison. And also there are changes in the supervision of released offenders, and counties now supervise lower level felons who prior to realignment would have been supervised by state parole. As a result of realignment, and we saw this already in the figure that I started off with here, fewer offenders are incarcerated. We see a drop in the prison population by about 27,000. That's about a 17% drop. And I think it's important to point out here that that drop really took place in the first year, which is the period that our study focuses on. So that has leveled off since, and we're not seeing further decreases in the prison population. With a shift in these responsibilities, it's not surprising that the county jail populations are going up. County jails did certainly absorb some of these offenders, but it's only a fraction of the decrease that the county jail population went up. Looking at the jail data, we see an increase of 9,000 in the county jail population. So as a result, we see about 18,000 offenders who are now not being locked up as a result of realignment. In other words, there are 18,000 additional offenders who prior to realignment would have been incarcerated, and they are not now as a result of realignment. So with this increase in so-called street time among a large number of offenders, it's not too surprising that this raised some concerns about crime. And that is what we're focusing on in this report. And just to give you a quick preview of what we're finding here, we're finding that realignment did have an increase on property crime, and that is concentrated on auto theft, but we find no evidence of any impact on the most serious violent crime, such as murder and rape. So we've certainly heard these concerns about realignment putting some upward pressure on crime. And this figure here is kind of explains part of that. So this figure, in the context of an increased number of offenders who are not being incarcerated, what we see is that California crime trends have been coming down for quite some time. Property crime had been coming down since the 1980s, early 1980s, and violent crime had been coming down since the early 1990s. But starting in 2012, we see an end to that long-term decline. That, combined with an additional number of offenders on the street, raised concerns about realignment playing a role here. And that's really what we are trying to answer here. Is realignment responsible for those recent upticks in crime? So the way we're going to go about answering this question is using a variety of empirical approaches to generate what turns out to generate a consistent picture of what the role of realignment is in terms of its impact on crime. Much of the work is focusing on the changes that we see at the county level. So what we do here is we compare the changes in incarceration to changes in crime rates by county. I showed to you the decrease in the prison population. It's important to point out that that decrease didn't uniformly affect counties. In other words, it didn't affect counties the same way. The counties that relied heavily on prison incarceration prior to realignment saw a bigger effect. In other words, in those counties, there are more offenders who are not being incarcerated as a result of realignment. So that's kind of what we're focusing in on here in trying to answer these questions. We compare these changes in incarceration rates to changes in crime rates by county. There are, of course, a number of factors that impact crime rates. And so it's important in our approach here that we account for those factors. And that includes county jail incarceration responses. Counties reacted by incarcerating some of these offenders, and it varies across the county. So it's absolutely crucial that we account for that. There are also pre-existing county differences in their crime trends and in how they are addressing these issues. So our approach also addresses that. There are trends, broader trends, statewide trends that also could be driving what we see. They are not driven by realignment. We also account for that. We also look at the possibility that changes in the economy is behind what we see, and changes in law enforcement personnel. But we don't find any evidence that suggests that the findings that I'm presenting here today are driven by those factors. In addition to the approach looking at the county changes, we also look at the statewide trends, just to see if the statewide trends are indicating that the changes that we see coincide with realignment. And then importantly, as I mentioned before, we take a step back to see if there's similar trends being observed in other states in the country. Of course, if we see the same kind of patterns in other states, it suggests that realignment is really not behind what we're observing in California. So let me move on and take a look at what the data is telling us. What I'm showing you here are the number of property and violent crimes that took place for the last 3 years, from January 2010 till the end of 2012. And if we start with the top line there, we see there's certainly variation there. There's variation due to seasonal factors. There's variation also that's driven by the number of days that are in a month. So we look, for example, you see some drops occurring about 3 times in this period. That's the month of February, which has several fewer days than other months. So that's part of what you see here. But more relevant to what we're trying to address here is that we see that the uptick in property crime appears to start around the time of realignment. When we look at the violent crime trend, we see fluctuations taking place before and after, and there is not really a strong or an indication here that the changes in the violent crime rates coincided with the rollout of realignment. So we're going to take a look now, and at least for now, I'm going to focus on property crime. I'm going to break that down by the 3 categories, the 3 offenses that make up property crime: burglary, larceny, theft, and motor vehicle theft. And we see that all of these 3 property crimes are starting to go up around the time of realignment. But the one that stands out the most here is auto theft. That's the bottom line here. And it's a little bit difficult to see in the figure. But if we convert what we see there in terms of the percentages, the increase in auto thefts are greater than the other 2. And then importantly, we see that the uptick in auto thefts coincide exactly with realignment, that it starts to move up right around the rollout of realignment. So just looking at state-wide data, monthly data, it suggests that realignment has something to do with property crime, but maybe not with violent crime. The next thing that I want to show you is moving on to our analysis of the county level data, where we are directly addressing and assessing what the changes in incarceration relationship is to crime. So this figure here, the orange dots represents our estimate of the number of crimes per fewer offender incarcerated in prison as a result of realignment per year. So that's what the dot is. That's our what we call a point estimate. The arrows represent the margin of error in these estimates. There's always some noise in generating these estimates. The longer this arrow is, the less precise are these estimates. And the ones that are statistically significant are those estimates where the arrows do not cross that horizontal 0 line. And what you see there is there's only one that this holds true for. So only auto theft increases can be attributed to realignment. So if we move on then and take a look at what's going on in other states, again, to see whether there's evidence that what we see in California is also going on elsewhere. If we start off by looking at violent crime, we see that many other states also experienced increases in violent crime. And I'm showing you here what the percentage increases are between 2011 and 2012. That's the top row. And the row below that shows you the number of states that saw larger increases in that particular crime than California. And we see for violent crime overall, there are 10 other states that saw bigger increases. And then you see for the other violent crimes, it's between 15 and 21 other states that had larger increases. But then also, if you look at those states, you see a variety of patterns there that makes it a little bit difficult to say exactly what's going on. If we move on to property crime, we see that the increase in California in property crime, it stands out more than violent crime. We had an increase in property crime of about 7.8%. There were 4 states that saw a larger rise in property crime between 2011 and 12 than California. The last column there is motor vehicle theft. We saw an increase in motor vehicle theft in California of about 14.8% in these numbers that are relying on FBI's Uniform Crime Report data. And there were only 2 states that saw a larger increase than California. So it looks like if you just look at these numbers alone, it's very difficult to say if our trend stands out or not. So in order to address that, what we're going to do is, in this report, and what we did is, we went to the data and we looked at the crime trends of other states. And we found comparison states in where their crime trends matched up very well to California prior to realignment. And the question then is, or the tactic here is that, well, if we can find such comparison states where the trends were really the same prior to realignment, now we can use them to represent what would have happened in California had we not passed realignment. Starting with violent crime, what we see is that our violent crime trends tracks very closely to these comparison states prior to realignment, which is really the design of this method here. It continues to do so after. So California does not stand out in terms of its violent crime trend when we compare it to those other states. The picture is different when we move on to property crime. We see, you see that we are able to really, truly, closely match up California's crime trend in property crimes prior to realignment to our comparison states. And then you see in 2011 that this starts to diverge. So in other words, what our cross-state analysis here, looking at comparison in the context of other states, it confirms our findings of the county-level data. We see increases in violent crime, but what the analysis is telling us is that that's part of a broader trend that we've seen in other states as well. And we wouldn't tie this to realignment and the increase or the decrease in incarceration that came about due to that reform. It's a different story when we look at property crime. It stands out. It's caused by realignment, and it's concentrated on auto thefts. Our estimates here are that we see about 65 more auto thefts per 100,000 residents per year as a result of realignment. Translated into just the number of auto theft, that's about 24,000 additional auto thefts per year. Also worth putting this in the historical context. This, what it does is it reverses a declining trend, and we're back at levels that we saw quite recently to the ones that we saw in 2009. Okay, so we do see realignment having an impact on crime, that it led to an increase, particularly in property crime, concentrated on auto theft. So one might then ask, well, should we incarcerate more people? Should we go back to what we had done before and incarcerate more people? In order to shed light on that, we're going to take a closer look at the crime preventive effectiveness of incarceration and make some comparison to some alternative strategies. So the first thing here that we do is we take a look at the county level data, and what I'm showing you here is a figure that shows the number of crimes per offender who's not incarcerated in prison as a result of realignment at the county level after the first year. And what the line there represents the estimate here. And since it's downward sloping here, so it goes, it's higher on the left side of our figure here than it is on the right side, it tells us that the counties with higher incarceration rates did not prevent more crime. So, and that's kind of an important finding here that is consistent with the existing research that shows that the crime preventive effects of incarceration decreases with higher levels of incarceration. And we see that in our county level data here as well. So that's something that we want to keep in mind as we move forward here. Our estimates here in general that I presented before tells us that there's about 1.2 more property crimes per year for each offender on the street. So put slightly differently, incarceration of an offender for 1 year prevents about 1.2 more property crimes. We don't find that it has, at the incarceration rates that we were at the time of realignment, that it has a more widespread effect, that it's preventing violent crime. So it might be reasonable then to ask, well, why aren't realignment's effects more widespread and greater? I think there are two answers to that question. One is that the policy targets these lower level, nonviolent, non-sexual, non-serious offenders. So there are very few offenders with a more serious record who are not being incarcerated as a result of realignment. At the same time, and this is going back to the figure that I showed you a minute ago, it shows also at the high incarceration rates, roughly at the time of realignment, we were about 435 inmates in prison per 100 residents. At those higher level, incarceration has a lower impact on crime. Okay? We also wanted to see if the results and the findings here can be helpful and can be put into context of the current situation of the prison population. In spite of the decrease of 27,000 in our prison system that realignment succeeded in reducing the population by, we're still short of the federal mandated target, and it's about 8,000 offenders that we need to reduce our prison population. So we take a look here at, well, what if we were to achieve that target by drawing down the prison population in a non-incarceration response, so something like early release, for example. Obviously, what kind of impacts that will have will depend on the specific population that we were to not incarcerate anymore. But basically, under the assumption that it has a similar risk profile to the offenders that are on the street as a result of realignment, what we estimate here is that it would put some additional upward pressure on our property crime trend, and it will be somewhere between 7 and 12% greater than the realignment effect. Okay, so we have now our estimates of what realignment is doing in terms of its impact on crime. An important question is, well, it has an impact on crime. The reduction in incarceration has led to increases in property crime. Are we getting a good return on our incarceration investment in terms of crime prevention? So our estimate again are that each prison year served prevents 1.2 property crimes, and that these are specifically auto thefts. So we can put this in the context of a cost-benefit analysis. The benefit of incarceration is that it prevents crime. At the incarceration rates that we were at the time of realignment, it is concentrated on auto theft. So we will prevent 1.2 auto thefts. Going to Rand's estimates what the cost of auto thefts are to society of about $9,500, it suggests that the benefit of incarcerating an offender in prison can be translated to about $11,800, say about $12,000. The cost of incarcerating that person in prison is close to $52,000. Okay? So this simple calculation then tells us that an additional dollar spent on incarceration yields about 23 cents in crime savings. Not a very high return on that investment. On the other hand, we look at a research literature that is addressing another strategy that has a strong base that shows that increased policing is another crime preventive strategy that can be pursued. If we look at the most recent research there, we find that $1 spent on additional policing yields $1.6 in crime savings. So a much higher return than what we see for incarceration. All right, so let me just wrap this up here. So to summarize, realignment's impact on crime so far is limited to property crime. We don't find any evidence that it has any impact on the most serious violent crimes such as murder and rape. We do see these increases in crime, but increases in crime is not really a given. It's not something that we have to accept. We're spending less money on prison incarceration. We could imagine to channel those savings into some alternative crime control strategy. The one that we're focusing on in this report was policing, and that's one promising strategy. And just to put the numbers that I had on the previous slide in a slightly different, from a slightly different perspective, it tells us that an additional dollar spent on policing rather than on incarceration would prevent 3.5 to 7 times more crimes. And this is just one alternative strategy that we're looking at. And there might very well be other alternatives to incarceration that are more cost-effective than incarceration. So that would be certainly where we think it's important that we head next, is trying to identify what are those alternative approaches that we can apply here in the state of California to not see further increases in crime or possibly even decreases. And that's it.
Give them a chance to have a seat here, and I think what we'll do is we'll have people who have questions turn to either side of the room where Marjorie and Kelly are standing with microphones. We'd like you, if possible, to ask your question in the microphone so that we can record it in the proceedings. So with that, do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering whether or not you were able to look at, particularly across counties, whether or not the use of risk assessment tools makes any difference in terms of the crime rate that you see.
So, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so we actually aren't able to observe what each county is doing in terms of their risk assessment. We are able to statistically control for broad differences across counties in the models that we do, so we sort of adjust for those factors. But this is a big issue across the country, risk assessment both for the pretrial population as well as for the probation population, and that's something that is very much deserving of further study and that a lot of foundations are focused on at the moment.
Other questions? In the middle here.
When you looked at rates of auto theft, what penal code sections or vehicle code sections did you look at? Did you look at grand theft auto or vehicle code section 10851, or did you look at a group of them? Some of them are misdemeanors or alternate felony misdemeanors, and so I don't know whether you factored in the charging or if you just looked at a particular penal code section that would have indicated a straight felony.
So we use data from the uniform crime reports, which are basically, well, it's the data that eventually will be in the uniform crime reports. And they're instances of auto theft reported to the individual reporting units of the FBI, which are individual police departments that are then aggregated, sent to the state AG's office, and then eventually sent to the FBI. So what we're using, we don't have incidents by penal code, but we have the aggregate number of auto thefts reported by each police department to the state, and then we use that to aggregate up to the county.
Are you guys able to deduce whether the increased property crime rate was attributable to offenders released under AB 109, or they're just new crimes in general?
We're not able to answer that question specifically. What we do know from a previous report that we came out with in June of this year is that the offender population that is not being incarcerated as a result of realignment is a mixed crowd. It includes parole violators who are not being incarcerated now, who in prior to realignment would have been sent back to state prison. It includes the what's called the 1170H population. So these are lower level felons who are not being incarcerated in county jails. Some of them, it didn't change the sentence length, but they have split sentences, meaning that they're going to serve a part of that in jail, and then part of it is going to be served, being supervised by probation. But we also see in that report that this population includes misdemeanors, so even lower level offenders than the felons that are directly affected by realignment, and also inmates who are awaiting trial. So it's a very mixed population here, and it's not only realigned offenders who are affected.
Did you look at drug crimes at all?
So the uniform crime reports doesn't have reported drug crime, so there's no actual report of a victim calling in a drug crime, so it's a very hard category to analyze. We didn't look at drug arrests, so no, we looked just specifically at the Part 1 7 felony offenses: murder, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, larceny, burglary, and motor vehicle theft. Those 7 crimes, when the crime rate is reported nationally or at the state level, the violent crime rate is the sum of those 4 violent crimes, the property crime is the sum of those 3. It's a pretty standard way to analyze crime in the United States.
Were you able to see if any of the uptick in property crimes was in any way attributable or correlated with the widening income and wealth inequality in these counties where these upticks happen?
Well, so we do control for broad county differences that would contribute to crime. Over the time period that we're studying, probably there's not a lot of increase in inequality, or there certainly are counties that are very unequal and counties that are more equal. We're unable to identify or statistically measure an independent effect of those factors. But it is the case, we know from prior research, right, that there appears to be an impact on unemployment on property crime. There appears to be an impact of poverty on property crime, and low incomes on property crime, and low wages on property crime. So these are all things that are changing in a way that in some ways coincides with realignment. It's important that we account for them, and we try to by adjusting for broad county differences.
And we also looked at, we incorporated county unemployment rates to see if changes in economic factors had an impact, once those were included in our analysis, if that had an impact on our estimates, and we find no evidence that our estimates are sensitive to that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you're going to use the approach that they use in Washington State to do a very sophisticated cost-benefit analysis of various alternatives to incarceration. There's a impressive literature there on that.
Yeah, so actually, so the Washington State Institute of Public Policy regularly issues these tomes where they review all of the research on specific topics, and then they do a cost-benefit analysis to say what's the return on a dollar of spending. And that's essentially what we tried to do at the end of our analysis, was to put a dollar value on the crimes prevented for the realigned population, and then to compare that to at least one alternative, and that is policing. Clearly, there's more that one could do. We could be looking at different rehabilitative interventions. We could look at cognitive behavioral therapy, occupational training, drug therapy, drug addiction therapy, and many other things. We haven't done that in this particular instance. We're looking specifically at the crime effect and then trying to characterize it, at least relative to one competing alternative use of funds.
I had a comment and a question. It seems that there's been an all-or-nothing approach to a lot of the stuff around realignment that, I've often said, well, people decided early on if this was a good or a bad thing, and they spent the last year or two trying to prove themselves right. And so I think the study, what's wonderful about it is you didn't stop at just what was going on with crime. You really went to the next step about what are the alternatives. And, Joan Petersilia's work about, all the things she's been kind of releasing lately about some of these struggles, there's no perfect anything. So instead of, going from either have realignment or don't have realignment, looking at what the problems are in the middle somewhere seems like a much more rational approach, because certainly locking everybody up isn't all good, but realignment has its problems. So what do we do to try to intervene? So I really like the fact that you've gone to this next step and said, here are some options, because I think frequently we look at data and then we say, okay, see, it's failed. And you've said, okay, there may be some things we could do to tighten it up. So given that, will you be doing, I think it sort of goes along with the other question that was asked, but it would be great if we looked at other alternatives and things that would help to mitigate some of this so that we can be successful. So I wondered kind of what your plans might be.
I think that's certainly an important next step is really to try to identify what those specific alternative approaches are that are more effective than incarceration. Go into the literature, we could go and look at, as was mentioned, the Washington State's Institute of Public Policy, their evaluation. But at the same time, it's a question of identifying approaches that work here in California, in specific counties. And PPIC is involved in a very important effort here to collect data. We're working with Riken and Mia Bird and Sonia Tafoya are heading up these efforts to reach out to the counties, collect individual level information, and that will include what kind of approaches the counties are using, so that we can take that information and identify what are those approaches that really do work. We're not going to see those results for a couple of years, and that's a little bit frustrating that we can't come up with those answers at this particular point in time. But there certainly are efforts in place that aims to identify what are some good ways that we can handle this.
Hi, sort of a similar question, I guess. Your report's already been quoted in the media today as kind of proof, by some people, not universally, by some people, that realignment isn't working. And I wonder if you could step away from the hard data for just a minute and give us an opinion about that. Is realignment working, and what does your report say about that kind of big picture?
I'll take a stab at it.
Sure.
So I guess I'll give you an answer in terms of, prior research on this question, right? So there are a number of studies that look at the effect of prison releases on crime and rates of incarceration on crime. And some of them use methods very similar to what we did here, right? Lots rely on court-ordered prisoner releases, okay? So for example, there's a famous study by Stephen Levitt, the author of Freakonomics, when he was a young scholar, that looks at that for the US. And what that research tends to show is the number of crimes prevented per inmate in years past and in other countries is way higher than what we're finding here. So for example, I did an analysis of a very large prisoner release in Italy that occurred in 2006, where they let go a third of their inmates from literally one day to the next. And the estimates are on the order of 13 to 20 felony offenses per year served. Here we're finding 1.2. And then not only property crimes, but violent. Or Steve Levitt's research suggests that the effects are on the order of 10 to 20 crimes per year. And here we're finding 1.2, and only for property, not for violent. And the difference across these studies is that those two that I cited are in contexts where the incarceration rate was much, much lower than what it currently is in California, or more specifically what it was in California when realignment went into effect. So, my reading of the results is that the crime effect isn't particularly large, okay? The most serious crimes, the crimes that are most costly to society, haven't been impacted. And frankly, we've reversed our incarceration rate back to what it was in the early 90s, and we have not seen a reversal of crime rates back to what it was in the early 90s. So the sky didn't fall. So I wouldn't my own opinion is I wouldn't see this as realignment as a failure. It's that realignment had some impact on crime, and this crime in particular. Let's think about ways to fix it. And that's my opinion.
Do you want to add anything, Magnus?
Not really.
Well, first off, I think it was a well-done report generally, and I think you included a number of caveats that were well needed. I think the media may miss out on some of that, which is unfortunate. I'm interested in the comparisons you made between states. The first set of states you showed that violent and property crimes, that there were some states that were showing similar trends of increases. But then when you went to comparable states, you could show a trend, and you said that it's directly attributable to realignment. Now, in the first set of states, you're showing similar increases in some of these crimes. Why are you saying that for the second set of states that you're saying are comparable, and I know you're matching them in this sense, is it separate and it is directly attributable to realignment? When in these other states, they're showing similar patterns, and it's not due to realignment.
Do you want me to go back to the slide question?
If you can go back actually to if it's possible to go back. So what I showed you were two tables. I started off with a couple of tables where you saw the changes in property and violent crime between 2011 and 2012. And the reason for showing you those were that if you simply look at individual states, it's very difficult to say whether California stands out or not. That's really the message there. The question is then, if you are going to do a comparison of California to other states, what is really a good set of states to compare California to? The way we addressed that was to go to the data and let us tell who are those states that we should compare California to. And so we take California's crime trends prior to realignment, so the 10 years prior to realignment, and we compare it to all other states in the US to see if there's a combination of states that can give us very similar pre-realignment crime trends. We can do that for both property and violent crime. And what we see then is that in the post-realignment period for violent crime, California continued to track quite closely to our comparison states. But that's very different from what we see in the property crime rate, where they are completely overlapping prior to realignment. And then come 2011, the year when realignment was rolled out, we see a divergence then. We also go about and do the same kind of exercise for all other states, just to make sure that what we're saying is realignment here really is realignment. If there's some other kind of factor that's driving these broader trends, we would expect that a number of other states would have the same kind of uptake when we do the same kind of exercise. For property crime, we find that California stands out in that kind of setting as well. That is not true for violent crime. So that's, for that particular analysis, that's what gives it credibility. And it's also the fact that it's extremely consistent with what we see in the county level data. And I think both Steve and I found that very comforting, that it was so close, the estimates, the patterns, everything that we saw at the county level data coincides with what one would conclude if you simply looked at the state level data and put California in the context of what happened in other states.
Hello, I had a couple of questions about your cost-benefit analysis. The first had to do with the incarceration cost associated with locking up one inmate for 1 year. You had a figure of $51,900. I was wondering about the source of that figure and how it was broken down, because I have information from the Department of Corrections that the figure is closer for a single inmate to $73,000 per year.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The source we're using is the Legislative Analyst Office in their 2013 primer on criminal justice in California. That's our source.
Yeah.
Okay. My second question had to do with the alternative uses of resources. And I think given PPIC's reputation, obviously there's a lot of interest in your report. Policymakers are going to be looking at it closely. For them in particular, there's definitely an interest in looking at a range of options. So in terms of additional resources for law enforcement, it's a little bit concerning that there wasn't maybe one other option. For example, there is empirical evidence out there that if you devote resources on a systematic basis toward job training, you can bring recidivism rate down, and that helps feed that statistic about how much additional crime have we seen. So I'm just curious as to why, and there's various other programs, there's drug rehab, et cetera, but specifically job training, why was there no decision to include that within the alternate range of resources?
Well, I'll try to answer that in two parts. So part of the reason why we focused on police per se is because that is an area that is so actively researched at the moment and seems to kind of all conclusively say that there's a very large impact of an additional officer on police. And many have concluded, based on these kind of cost-benefit calculations, that many U.S. states are under police, that our levels are inefficiently low, and we over-rely on after-the-fact punishment, less on before-the-fact deterrence. The other, with regards to job training, there are some promising demonstrations out there regarding job training, in particular the Center for Economic Opportunities in New York, that uses transitional jobs for offenders that are coming out, seems to have sizable effects on recidivism. Aside from job training, we know, for example, in Hawaii, the HOPE program, which is an effort to try to monitor probationers a little bit more closely, punish them with modest sanctions, but sanctions that are very certain, and match them with services that they need, especially for those that have drug treatment, has led to a big reduction in admissions to prison out of probation in Hawaii. So there are other alternatives out there. We picked one because we knew that the research at the moment is at a state where it's suggesting the effect sizes are fairly large and that a dollar spent there generates a big return. But that doesn't mean it's the only one, and you're certainly correct that as a state we should be thinking about how we're going to spend our dollars to sort of keep crime low in this new institutional arrangement that we're in.
Hi. A number of counties have begun sort of their mad dash for more dollars to build more jails as a result of realignment in their counties. And I'm sort of wondering, I know that you talked earlier about the diminishing return in terms of crime reduction when it comes to building more prisons or more jail or more incarceration. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the counties that you've found sort of pursuing that high incarceration sort of strategy. And just, you know, I thought I saw Kings County on there was maybe one of them. Could you talk about some of that?
Well, we're not looking specifically at that in this particular report, but given that we're talking about county jails, it might be a time to talk about our previous report that came out in June, where we look specifically at the impact of realignment on county jail populations. And I think one of the things that we see there is that realignment with the shift of responsibilities to the counties presented some serious challenges to our sheriff departments and the county jails. And we were operating our county jails above their design capacity as a result of realignment. So there are a number of challenges there. The county jails, with the current caseload, are in many counties are finding those kind of difficulties to find the appropriate number of beds for their caseload. There are also some challenges there in that there are 18 counties that face court-ordered population caps that makes it difficult for them to handle some of these situations. So there are a number of complex issues there that are taking place right now. And the state is providing funding towards jail expansion, AB 900. There's also SB 1022 that also provide additional funding for county jails. I think it's important when we look at the county jail situation as well is that there are a number of facilities that are very old, that the expansion or the spending on county jails is not only one about, oh, let's add more beds and incarcerating more. It is that these facilities are really old, and it makes it extremely difficult to provide services and treatments for the inmate population as well. And that's hopefully, with these additional dollars, the counties will take those approaches to build facilities that will also utilize these kind of approaches as well.
I think that PPIC is doing a wonderful job at trying to assess the impacts of realignment at the county level. My question is related to the use of aggregate data versus the use of offender level data, and examining those people who are in county jails, and are they pretrial, or are they truly people who were realigned to the counties, and what efforts are going to be taken to kind of track offenders over time to assess kind of behavior at the standard 1, 2, and 3 year recidivism interval rates?
Well, you're absolutely right. We are relying at this point in time to answer these very important questions. What we're relying on are these aggregate data. These are numbers, just the numbers are sentenced inmates, unsentenced inmates, pretrial population, and so forth. And there's certainly a need for more specific information about this offender population. But that is, again, we're hoping that this project, what we call the multi-county project, where PPIC is working with the BSCC in 11 counties to collect individual level information. That is also going to include individual level jail information as well. So hopefully, again, hopefully in the near future, we'll have some more detailed information about those kind of situations.
Do you want to say anything about the other recidivism work, which uses CDCR data? Thanks for...
If you want to talk about it.
I was just going to mention that we have a couple of other projects that are using CDCR data, which would be individual level data. Doesn't necessarily answer the questions you posed about jails, but it's really centrally about trying to understand how and whether recidivism patterns have changed after realignment.
I have a couple questions. One is, I want to be correct, is your data showing that these particular inmates that were part of the realignment, the uptick in property crimes or auto theft crimes, are these particular inmates, were those the ones that were released? Like, was that their crimes? Did that fall under that category?
So, okay, realignment has increased street time for several populations. So one set of group is going to be people who are paroled, who are now, when they violate parole, instead of being sent back to prison, they'll do a few days in jail, and they tend to be on the street more than they would have in years past. There's also people who are pretrial, who are being released early relative to, and then there's also people who are convicted who are serving time in jail before, who are released early because there's capacity problems in jail. So the population on the street that may be committing these crimes is kind of a mix of those with a pretty heavy dose of people who are on parole. Now, realignment does indeed target low-level property offenders. So if you look at admissions to CDCR and where they declined, it actually, there's something that I think is sometimes misreported in the press as they say realignment is early release. It's not what happened. It's just that admissions into CDCR are at much lower rates than they were in the past. So you see declines, big declines in admissions for second-degree burglary, for larceny theft, for auto theft, and for drug crime. So the groups of people who are more likely to be on the street are indeed people that are being convicted for felony property crime.
And then my second question would be, I guess, I don't know if you know if stats can, if you could, this could be, they say there's usually a gateway crime to the murders and other things. Do you see that happening here, or would you have to wait a few years to see if that happens, that these inmates who are realigned, and not all inmates, as you said, there's different pools, will that become, then you'll see an uptick years later in the violent crimes?
Well, that's a good question. So my best guess, okay, would be that the effect of realignment on crime is what we've seen. I don't think there's reason to believe that people who are doing less time are going to escalate to more serious crimes as a result. For the most part, what we know from the criminology literature is that the likelihood someone offends peaks when they're very young, so when they're 18, 19, 20 years old, and then falls off. And by the time people are in their 30s and their back starts to hurt, they're not doing crime anymore. Okay, somebody with back pain, I'll tell you. So, you know, there's no, I don't see any reason to believe that these people are going to become super predators because we're not putting them away. There's nothing in my knowledge of empirical criminological research that would suggest that would occur.
I just wanted to confirm there were male and female prisoners in your study.
Yes, but it's mostly male, mostly, just way overwhelmingly male.
My question is very related to that. Do you have anything from what you've studied that talks about gender differences in the effects of the policies?
Well, we're studying aggregate data. So we're looking at, you know, total admissions, total releases from CDCR, and total crime. So unfortunately, we can't look specifically at gender differences.
Other questions? We have a few minutes left. Yeah.
Just a point of clarification. When you say increased policing, does that mean just an increased police presence, or does that also mean increased arrests?
Well, the research that's out there is staffing levels, so sworn officers. So higher staffing levels are associated with lower crime. In part, it's because they apprehend people and there's higher arrests, but also part it's just general deterrence. You know, there's actually quite a few very interesting studies that show things like when terror alerts are higher and there's more police on the mall in Washington, D.C., crime falls around the mall, right? And it doesn't go to other neighborhoods in D.C., it's just slower with more police on the street. Or the COPS program during the 90s that was a federal effort to expand policing through a grant to local police departments from the federal government. Vast expansion in police forces led to large declines in crime and not necessarily a large increase in arrests. So it could occur through more policing and apprehending the usual suspects, but it could also occur just through more community policing, more presence on the street, more visibility, higher deterrence.
Did you look at if there were any impact of reduction in police forces due to the recession, to the increase in property crime?
We did take a look. There's annual data on the law enforcement personnel at the county level. And what we see that there is, I think it might be part of what you have here is a just the facts. It's not, I'm being told now, but there is on a website, you'll find a just the facts on policing in California that talks about the trends in policing here. And what we see is that the decline is starting, not surprisingly, at the time of the Great Recession in 2008. So we don't see that these decline in the number of officers are taking place and coinciding with the rollout of realignment. And we also go a step further and we look at those county level changes that took place between 2011 and 2012 to see if they're really correlated with what we see as more offenders on the street, right? Which is what we're using for estimating the impact. And that's where we don't see a relationship there. There's not a statistical significant relationship there. So that's what gives us that kind of confidence that we're not picking up that effect here.
Remaining questions? Well, I'd like to thank Magnus and Steve for stimulating interesting conversation. We will be around here for the next few minutes if you want to come up and ask other questions.